I'm going to read the first few stories of the first few pages from a story called Slack. The only thing I'll tell you is that when I was writing this story, I was thinking about communal trauma. I was also thinking about how sometimes the people who emigrate because of personal trauma. Okay, so here's Slack. When this story ended, or when it began, because who on June Plum Road could tell the difference, the mermaids were floating at the top of old Henry's tank. The green hair of one and the pink hair of the other fanned out on the water's surface, silky straight hair, and the sparkles in their tails caught the afternoon light. Old Henry laughed when he saw the dolls in his tank, a laugh he would later regret, because when he looked beyond the mermaids, his eyes made out two forms, the little girls, beneath the water's surface. And the mother would go mad when she heard, at least for a while, sitting on the front of her steps, legs wide without panties, ashamed a man passing by was the one to call out to let her know about her nakedness. Her people would send for her, and news would travel back that she's cleaning for white people in New York. Many on June Plum Road won't know what to do with this information, but to wonder if she wears panties now. Some people would say that they sensed tragedy before old Henry found the mermaids and the girls in his tank. Lazarus said his chickens wouldn't lay eggs. After the girls were found, he walked up and down June Plum Road, telling any heir he came across that when a whole dozen chickens won't lay a single egg, a sensible man should start to shiver. Mrs. Thomas, who everybody called Bad Mind Thomas behind her back, dropped the malice she held towards everyone in the district to say again and again, "Oh, that's why the dogs were barking." While she walked her dog, she heard people talking about the drownings in front of the shop. The dogs were two fluffy yellow animals her husband brought home when her menstrual blood continued to greet her after a decade of marriage. The dogs laid up on the Thomases' couch and bed and ate out of their hands like white people on television. This is why people on June Plum Road looked at Mrs. Thomas sideways, which in turn caused her to carry malice against everybody in the district. Miss Marie, who taught 4th grade at the primary school before she retired, said from the hungry way she saw the two girls move toward any little bit of water with the mermaid dolls, something told her. Maybe the Lord, she would add to later versions of the story, that kind of hunger in anyone, especially children who can't think level-headed, wouldn't do anybody any good. Then there was Tony, tall legs Tony, who said that because her C-section scar was itching her, she knew that the Lord was trying to tell her something, but what it was she didn't know. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she would say to any of the clients who paid to have her hot comb dragged through their hair for the Christmas church service. But nobody paid Tony Santamonia's talk any mind. The ladies just fingered their newly straightened hair and kissed their teeth when they left Tony's house, because she was known to visit the Abia man every once in a while when her man didn't come home to her. The Seventh-day Adventist pastor explained to his congregation that days leading up to the drownings, he started to worry that something bad was going to happen. The uneasiness even kept him up at night. Some nights he would wake up with a piece of worry he had never been handed in his life, and it would be a long time before he could fall asleep again, sometimes not until the sun began to rise. He even started to believe what his mother used to say about curry, that if you ate too much and too often, it made you fret. Since it was his wife's biggest pregnancy craving, he was eating curry more often than before, some days even back to back, and his wife put curry in foods he didn't think could be curried, like the scrambled egg she put in front of him one morning. But then when news came about the little girls, that night he could sleep. And that night he could sleep. And because he was a crying kind of pastor, the kind whose voice would start to crack whenever he preached an Easter or Christmas sermon, or presided over a funeral, he cried after telling his congregation how it turned out not to be the curry after all. Because old Henry drank his wife's cornmeal porridge for his midday meal, and it sat heavy in his stomach, and because he'd become an old man prone to paralyzing bouts of fatigue, he slept after lunch. This, even though in his younger days he used to cry shame after a man who let a meal put him back in bed. Later, he would say it was as if something shook him awake. He got out of bed, and as he was going outside, his wife looked up from the pea she was shelling to ask where he was going. But he didn't pay her any mind, because all he knew was that he had to look about his tank. He thought he was a young boy yet again turning his tank into a swimming pool, as wide as the king-size mattress he and his wife slept on, and tall enough so that old Henry's feet could almost touch the bottom. The tank was a cement structure behind the house, used for collecting rainwater, to wash clothes, to bathe, to boil for drinking. His wife would tell everyone who would listen to her that a crying old man is the ugliest thing to see. "You think you've seen ugly?" she would ask. "You want to see an old man crying." Who knew what was story and what was God's truth? But only Marie opened her window the day it happened. Only Marie who could have stopped it. Marie who kept silent amidst all the talk of the little girls. She saw the girls pulling a cement block in the direction of old Henry's tank, but just before she opened her door to call out to them, she paused to turn on the fire under the pot of chicken food soup she was cooking. And when she went back to open the door, she could only pause with her hand on the handle because she couldn't remember why she meant to open the door. Only when she heard the mother screaming, people ways over say they heard the mother screaming, did she remember. But if the screams told her anything, they told her it was too late. But if we were to go back before it happened, Christmas time was what was on everyone's mind. Not the two little dark-skinned girls, 6 years old, who everyone always mixed up because they looked exactly alike, and their names Cadian and Jadian were so similar. 3 days after they were dead, it was Christmas Day. On June Plum Road, those who could afford to were eating the goat their husbands slaughtered. Those who couldn't afford a goat were eating chicken. And those who didn't have anything made sure to be invited to the homes of those who had extra meat. But the meat took on a disappointing taste that year. Some people thought it was because they had been looking forward to Christmas dinner for so long that it was bound to be disappointing. Some of the wives said they anticipated it, as the food never tasted good when the same hand picking the feathers off the chicken or skinning the goat and chopping up the meat was the same hand dealing with the blood, was the same hand dealing with seasoning the meat, cooking it, and finally serving it onto plates. No one thought to blame the little girls whose drownings dominated the Christmas dinner conversation. The girls belonged to the slack girl who moved to the district to live with her grandmother when her own pious mother refused to keep a pregnant teenager under her roof. She eventually took over her grandmother's house when the old lady died. She mothered the girls without a man and took in sewing because it was all she could do beautifully. She was a dark-skinned, dry-headed girl, and not even the kind of dark skin that shone, so everybody, even those who lightened their skin, had to admit that shade of brown was something to look at. Her mother used to suck on Scotch bonnet peppers when she was pregnant, and then when the child came out from between her mother's legs and everyone saw she took her father's coloring, the name Pepper stuck. But they used to call her Blackie or Dryhead when she was in school, and no one had to tell her she wasn't the kind of girl anyone looked at more than once. Maybe that's why she lay down for the first man who paid her any mind, even though he was a married man with 4 children and had only 3 good teeth in his mouth. When the wife heard that her husband got some young girl pregnant, she turned up at Pepper's house with a machete in her hand. Not because she was expecting to cut Pepper, since the machete was too dull, but because she wanted to look tough. No one answered the door, so she walked around to the back of the house and saw a young girl still wearing her school uniform, sitting on a rock and bending over to scale fish. No one had to tell her it was her husband's baby mother. She knew because the girl looked like the right kind of weak-minded to lie down for a man with only 3 good teeth in his mouth. Before the girls drowned, all anybody knew about Pepper with any kind of conviction was that she was slack to have children for a married man. They said that even God thought to punish her, giving her 2 children instead of 2. But she could sew beautifully. She sewed the white suits for the deaconesses at the Methodist church. When the reverend's wife, who everyone thought acted better looking than she was, saw the suits, even she had to humble herself to whisper and ask someone who sewed them. Pepper couldn't tell she had 2 babies inside her. When they pressed against her belly, she felt it as one touch. She craved raw rice. She used to stand over the canister her grandmother kept the rice in, willing herself to resist the temptation, and sometimes she could. Other times she would scoop a handful into her mouth, but only when the craving felt like it would kill her. That's why when Pepper's grandmother pulled the first baby out of her granddaughter, everything looked all right until her attentive eyes made their way to the baby's back. She studied the baby's back for a few seconds. There was raw rice stuck to the baby's skin. And for a moment, Pepper's grandmother held the baby in her hands because the rice did look permanent, like a disease or a disfigurement. But when she rubbed her hand across the baby's back, her hand came back bloodstained, brushing some of the rice onto the bedroom floor. All her life, as far back as memory took her, Pepper was always craving something. First, sugar from the tin her mother kept it in. These were the days her mother used to comb Pepper's hair in 2, like cow horns sticking out the sides of her head, ribbons hanging from the ends of her plaits. Pepper would scoop a little sugar into her fingers, small enough so that her mother wouldn't notice. But the cumulative occurrences always revealed the theft, plus the fact that she forgot to reattach the lid of the canister, which invited ants into the sugar. When Pepper was a little older, she used to take a piece of dough from the large lump her mother left sitting to be made into dumplings. She would knead the dough between her dirty fingers and then push it around her mouth before swallowing it. Later on, when Pepper no longer wore bows in her hair, her mother developed a nighttime craving for water crackers dipped in tea, and Pepper eventually came to share the craving. After her mother boiled water over a smashed piece of ginger, after she poured the water into a cup and added a little sugar and a few crackers to the tea, she would start to eat the whole thing with a spoon, and Pepper would turn up next to her with a spoon of her own. Pepper didn't need to say anything. Her mother would push the cup in her direction, but not before complaining, "You don't feel good if you're not leaning on me." And then Pepper craved Lester, but not at first. When she first saw him at the front of the shop, playing dominoes with the other men her mother called Dutty, because they were idle playing dominoes in the middle of the day, she barely noticed them. And then he threw a fresh grin her way, not because she found her attractive, but because she was there, and he was a type of Caribbean man for whom schoolgirls in their uniforms are to be pursued without shame. Pepper called him Dutty in her mind and walked off hissing. But this was one of those things, the kind where the fruits of flattery wedged themselves where common sense repulsion and the fear of being seen together in public would be. This was one of those things where a more seasoned man is persistent enough, sweet-talking enough, to confuse a young girl so that she could look at his face and wonder if he couldn't do something by his teeth, maybe at least not grin so wide, while at the same time glowing under the light of his compliments. This was one of those old-time grown man, young girl stories. Nothing unusual in its pages. Thank you.